two, 1, 2, 3, go. Welcome to A New Tone. I'm Zach Morgenstern.
I'm Fraser Allen Best.
And Fraser, I wanted to start our conversation today by talking about a comedian called Ryan Long. And I was thinking maybe you could give our listeners a bit of background, since I think it was you who first introduced him to me.
Yeah. Well, he's a Toronto comedian who is now in New York, and he makes like small, like very short sketches that are, I think, just usually him or one friend. They're usually like kind of sketch comedy bits. And I would say if he had a theme, it would be making fun of partisan divides. His first big hit was, I think it was a video called
Woke versus Racist?
Yeah, Woke versus Racist, but it was, yeah, exactly. Good job with the title. It's just about, it's a number of quotes from, that a person, it's him and his friend, one of them playing the role of a kind of a woke person, a San Francisco wokester, and the other one playing a kind of a white supremacist style Spencer type character. What's the first name of Spencer?
Oh, Richard.
Richard Spencer type character, and saying a bunch of things that happen to align between the woke and the, like for example, we should have a dance night at clubs for only people of color, and then the white supremacist goes, oh yeah, I think they should be separate.
Right.
That's sort of but that's kind of the continued theme of a lot of his sketches, making fun of the left-right partisan divide. And I think I know where you're going to go next.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm about to go into scripted mode, but I think that's a good place to start it. I think a lot of his comedy is stuff that would irritate more liberal people, because he's comparing the absolute far right in a lot of his sketches to the somewhat far left. But the sketch that inspired today's monologue is a recent one he did about Israel and Palestine. And before I go further, let me make a disclaimer. I don't think of the monologue I'm giving now as being about Israel and Palestine. Such a conversation would require profound attention to detail and sensitivity towards loss of life. Where we sit in Toronto, Canada, we are not in conversation with any political factions in that part of the world. We are, however, in conversation with our peer group in North America. So that's why I'm not centering this conversation around Israel and Palestine. I'm centering it around the politically incorrect Canadian comedian Ryan Long. So Ryan Long made this sketch about Israel-Palestine, and despite the sort of criticism you might have just heard me make of him, I found this sketch strangely prescient. The sketch is done from the perspective of an actor, a typical Hollywood liberal, who was troubled because he hasn't made a social media statement on #Israel or #Palestine. The joke being that the actor cannot tell what the quote-unquote correct position on the conflict is. He contrasts this with subjects like pride, Black Lives Matter, and the Russian war in Ukraine, where it was relatively clear what kind of statement liberal Hollywood celebrities were expected to make. So I think this is one of Ryan Long's best comedy sketches. It's well-paced. I like how it incorporates some comedic live interviews with various characters he runs into. But it's also a rare case of there being little to no friction between my worldview and the messaging of Ryan Long's videos. Above all else, this sketch feels deeper than Ryan Long's usual shtick of tee-hee-hee, isn't political correctness silly? You see, Ryan Long is a comedian who makes fun of quote-unquote woke people. And being anti-woke is usually associated with being conservative, because conservative politicians like Ron DeSantis or pundits like Ben Shapiro like to rail against wokeness. But what Long's video illustrates is that wokeness as a political trend should not just be criticized by the right. While admittedly many liberals and many conservatives view the word woke and progressive as synonyms, if you look closely at how woke is used, that's not really the case. It refers to something more specific. And therefore, I'm going to say, talking about myself and others, that it's very possible to be on the political left without being woke. So, what is woke or wokeness? I would define wokeness as a political aesthetic, and that's key, aesthetic, not an ideology, that emerged in the mid-2010s. It brings together moderate liberals and radical leftists by invoking the militant language of the radical left, at least around issues of identity like race, gender, disability, and sexual orientation, but it doesn't really target particular establishment institutions like large corporations or liberal political parties. So after I saw Ryan Long's comedy video, I found a more serious YouTube video by a video essayist named Jared Bauer. He used to work for the channel Wisecrack. You know, from what I can tell, Bauer is someone who's solidly on the left. His favorite philosopher is Slavoj Žižek. And like me, Bauer believes in the importance of identifying wokeness as a phenomenon separate from leftism. He titled his own video essay on the subject, Will Israel versus Hamas End Woke? Citing an argument used by Žižek, Bauer argues that invoking woke political positions is a way liberal elites experience pleasure. For example, when one drinks a soda from a paper straw and the straw gets soggy and flimsy, they experience the satisfaction of feeling they experience some symbolic inconvenience in the name of fighting the good fight. Another example would be refusing to post Instagram selfies on a June Tuesday in 2020, but instead posting a plain black square in solidarity with George Floyd. Israel-Palestine, Bauer argues, does not present one with a metaphorical paper straw or black square. No matter what you write on social media, you will not be rewarded en masse by the broad liberal cultural world. No, in order to make a public statement on Israel-Palestine, you actually have to have convictions and be willing to take flak for them. So while I liked Bauer's video essay, that's why I'm mentioning it, I felt the argument about pleasure glossed over a more obvious way to frame the issue. And to illustrate that point, I'd like to read something a conservative friend of mine recently wrote on his Facebook page. It'll never not be bizarre to me that the far left is the group most vocally opposed to the idea of a group of people having been oppressed for millennia all over the globe and being subjected to the worst genocide in history being allowed to have safe haven for themselves.
Take it he's British.
He is. I also just needed to make clear that was not my perspective.
All right.
So if it's not obvious, the individual that individual was making the case for as Israel. In a nutshell, his argument is Jews are an oppressed group. The woke left loves standing with oppressed groups. So why doesn't the left stand with Israel? One of the tenets of wokeness is that there are certain fixed identity categories that are called oppressed groups or marginalized groups. I'll admit, I sometimes use the phrase marginalized groups. It can be a useful shorthand. But the problem comes when the shorthand actually replaces analysis. A few years ago, the Jewish British comedian David Baddiel wrote a book called Jews Don't Count. While disclaimer, I haven't read the book, I have seen him do various interviews about it, and his position is basically he wants Jews to be incorporated under the woke identity umbrella to count as one of the official marginalized groups. Now, in Baddiel's case, he uses that position to make arguments like they should have cast a Jewish actor to play Robert Oppenheimer. But there are other Jewish celebrities and non-Jewish celebrities who take that kind of thinking and apply it to Israel. So Sarah Silverman has basically applied the thinking in her comments on the subject. Jews are an oppressed group. Therefore, if people get too angry at the Jewish state, they are getting too angry at an oppressed group. It must be anti-Semitism. Amy Schumer, meanwhile, has shared a thoroughly mediocre rewriting of Martin Niemöller's famous poem, First They Came for the Jews. You can look it up if you want, but in this poem, Schumer, or whoever writes it, claims that she has supported the causes of various marginalized groups. She stood with Black Lives Matter. She stood against deportation. She stood with the LGBT. But none of them will stand with her because, quote, she is a Jew. Of course, wokeness doesn't have to lead to pro-Israel positions. Muslims and Arabs are also marginalized groups. Indeed, many people who would otherwise be called woke have gotten involved with the Palestine solidarity movement. But regardless of which side one picks, wokeness clearly fails as a method of reasoning. From a woke perspective, Israel-Palestine is one hashtag marginalized group against another. You have to pick, is now the time to fight anti-Semitism or to fight Islamophobia? But for those on the left or others who are not stuck in this woke mindset, such juvenile reasoning doesn't present a problem. My leftist analysis of the situation, for instance, is shaped by an infamous quotation from then-Senator Joe Biden, who stated, "Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region." So for me, as a Jewish leftist, there is no tension between opposing anti-Semitism and staunchly criticizing Israel. Because for me, the defining feature of Israel is not its Jewishness, but its militaristic, authoritarian role in the region. I digress. I did say I don't want this to be a monologue about Israel and Palestine, and I stand by that. This is not a monologue meant for Benjamin Netanyahu or Ismail Haniyeh's ears. This is a message meant for the Amy Schumers and Sarah Silvermans of the world. The left-wing pro-Palestine protesters these people are attacking, I'm fairly confident in saying most to all of them are not anti-Semites. And I'm fairly confident in saying that if you were being honest, Amy and Sarah, I think you know that. Many of them are your friends. They've organized alongside people like you for similar causes. I assure you, they are just as willing to denounce the horrible anti-Semitism from the notorious Charlottesville demonstrations as you are. They stand behind Palestine because they are leftists who oppose occupation, checkpoints, blockades, disenfranchisement, and bombings. You don't need to find some ulterior motive of anti-Semitism. There are solid left-wing reasons why they would take that position. Now, to be fair, I'm willing to say the opposite as well. My comrades on the left will often respond to the Amy Schumers of the world with maximalist rhetoric, accusing them of being enablers of genocide who will go down in history as supporters of mass atrocities. And I think we have to be charitable and realize even many of the people who are saying staunchly pro-Israel things right now from the West, they don't do so because they actually support the right-wing policies of the Netanyahu government. They do so because they have this idealized conception of Israel in their heads, of sharing the same progressive politics of the overall Jewish diaspora. They think they are standing with, again, a marginalized group against a bigotry. That reasoning might not hold up for us, but I do believe it is sincere. Wokeness tricks us into thinking social media is the real world. It tricks us into thinking we have to post on every subject, and that what we say in our online posts represents the moral truths of our soul. It does not. Most of us are powerless. Many of us have fiery emotions. But we cannot let this illusion make us see evil where it does not exist. The situation in Gaza right now terrifies me, but that situation will not be healed by North Americans, including North American celebrities, tearing each other apart over what ill-thought-out position they took on the internet. These are my thoughts on the subject, Fraser. It's a wide open field. What do you have to say?
It's a frighteningly wide open field because we're kind of straddling two topics here. We're on the edge of talking about Israel-Palestine, but I think we're actually talking mostly about how you define wokeism, because that's really what I think we can argue Ryan Long is getting at. You see it, Ryan Long, as purely a critic of wokeism. I think there's actually a way to see him as a critic of both the far left and the far right. Do you agree with wokeism that, however you define it, it sits at the far end of the left-right scale?
No. So my definition is that wokeness is this aesthetic coalition of the center left and the far left. So it can sound like it's on the far left spectrum while also not being. So Adolph Reed, for example, he's this African-American socialist political scientist, and he often describes wokeism, identity politics, as the left wing of neoliberalism, but to distinguish it from what he sees as the actual traditional left.
Is there anything that would be considered too left-wing a view? Like, can you get to the left of woke? What's to the left of woke?
Okay, so, I mean, the famous example is Hillary Clinton said in the midst of the 2016 Democratic primaries that breaking down the banks won't end racism. Many of us on the traditional left would say it won't end racism, but it would help a lot more than whatever anti-racist initiatives Hillary Clinton would champion. Whereas there are certain people in the realms of woke who either are just liberals and like Hillary Clinton, or they're radical Afro-pessimists who believe that the anti-capitalist and anti-racist struggles are so different that they would weirdly agree with Hillary Clinton. And then we're into semantics. Are the Afro-pessimists more left or are the anti-capitalists more left?
According to each of them, they would see Hillary Clinton as to the right of them, surely.
Yes. Though
is there any woke person who would see who would disavow some other person or some other viewpoint as being too far left of them through their own eyes? Because yes, you're right, we get into definitional issues, but is there anyone who's woke who goes, but I don't believe in blank? That would be unwoke. That would be past the woke threshold.
Right. Well, I guess the problem is very few woke people identify as woke, so maybe that's the problem with your framing. But
sure.
I think another illustrative example, Kimberly Crenshaw, the law scholar who coined the term intersectionality, she supposedly tweeted something along the lines of, why are big banks being more progressive on race than Bernie Sanders? Because I guess the banks were saying the exact things she wanted in the moment of Black Lives Matter, whereas Bernie Sanders was viewing things in a class. I mean, I don't really know what she was thinking of, but that would be an example where a militant woke position is weirdly more compatible with the traditional center than the traditional left.
Well, wokeism is more corporate, for sure. But is it more, okay, sure, yeah.
Yeah, because I think the
problem... But it seems like your answer is effectively no, though, that there's not real... That there may be woke people, people who you'd cluster into woke who are in this, or close to the center, but that it doesn't get more left than what we're terming woke. It seems to be your answer. Like that it actually covers a wide sprawl of the political spectrum from left to right.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we're just thinking about this too differently for this conversation to not keep running in circles. But I don't know. Do you have any follow-up questions?
I mean, I think with that nailed down, I think that was sufficient to nail down the parameters of woke. Because really, what I see as important is that I see this issue, the Israel-Palestine, and how it seems to have locked the gears of a lot of, even people in my own social media circles seem to be conflicted on how exactly to post about it. And I think part of the reason is that a lot of people are very, whether we can use the banner of woke or not, they're oriented towards social issues that are completely identitarian. And one of the problems is that geopolitics are kind of different, and the new left doesn't really have a singular view on geopolitics. Like, strangely, there is the Democratic Party has geopolitical views, has views on military intervention, and has stances on interstate conflict. But there's not really a good, like, the same people who are really enthusiastic about Black Lives Matter don't really have a foreign policy typically. And one of the problems is that this kind of new left is very, whether we define that as woke or not, is very preoccupied with social issues, but not necessarily geopolitics. And the collision between identity politics in the form of looking at even just Jews as an identity group, which seems to be the most comfortable way for people to talk about this, the Israel-Palestine conflict. It doesn't really translate well to an ongoing conflict. One of the problems that I think arises here is that people have the reflex to defend Jews as a minority, and then at the same time they have the reflex to defend, I think broadly speaking, people don't have a more defined category than Muslims, but I think that's the popular identity group that people talk about on the left. And they have a reflex to defend both those groups. But one of the problems is that when you look at things internationally, and this is kind of like a poli-sci 101 course fact, is that the international order is just anarchic. There's no, you can't, there is a zero-sum conflict, at least the way it currently sits between militant groups in Gaza and the Israeli government in a way that it doesn't really exist domestically. So, for example, you can both you can oppose hate crimes directed towards Jews or towards Muslims within a country, within the U.S. or within Canada, and those are not necessarily in conflict. Whereas I think people run into, and so you can be. It's obvious how to be socially progressive. Just go, all forms of oppression are bad. But when that's overlaid internationally on a conflict like the one that's going on in the Middle East right now, there's a real problem of like, you can't so flatly defend one group without seeming like you're condemning another. Mm-hmm. And I think that often happens when when people attempt to translate like their kind of domestic intuitions about defending minorities to international groups. It's like, well, you're gonna, I mean, I was gonna say defend the Uyghurs, well, that opposes the Chinese government, but there are other situations in which it's hard to take both sides simultaneously. I have a place I'm going with this, which is that there's a strange, one of the outcomes of this that I want to get your take on is that a lot of my social media is preoccupied with people saying either platitudinous bullshit or, as Ryan Long points out in his video, being accused of being silent or of falsely trying to tread the line between, without getting blamed, but saying something like, I just think there should be peace. I want people to be, to live without violence, this to be resolved without violence. The reflex of siding with the underdog does not produce a very good, it doesn't work when it comes to international issues. And people seem to struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, no, I think I agree a lot with your framing there. And I agree with your frustration. And this was referenced in the Ryan Long video of people saying things like, your silence is deafening. Again, this is people thinking social media is a real place that, every single individual with every single post has some responsibility to contribute. And I'd say before you have a responsibility to contribute, you should probably work on your responsibility to be informed. You should probably work on your responsibility to, have a good mind so that you can speak clearly and be comfortable with your behind. Being pressured to say the right thing doesn't make much sense at all. And I think there's one thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand, which is people assume that the truth is always apparent and easy, whereas, sometimes the truth with a given situation, there can be layers. It can be hard to know what's going on. So as I said, the one thing where I really disagree with other leftists is in my view of North American Zionists. They call them genocide apologists. I don't agree with that because I think most North American Zionists are liberal and progressive people who just have a very different sense of the reality of Israel than pro-Palestine North American leftists. They have a different sense of literally what's true in the world, and that's what makes this whole, vilifying people solely over what they write on social media not really make any sense at all.
Interesting. I think there's a problem here that we're defining that who in this conflict is distinctly on the left. I think you're implicitly there defining the support for Israel as being a right-wing position.
I mean, more or less, if you look at the dynamics in North America, in Europe, and in much of the world, it tends to be the position of left-wing political parties, albeit, far left political parties like communist parties to support Palestinian resistance. So in that sense, I'm not necessarily talking about Israel versus Hamas, where Hamas is obviously also a right-wing party. I'm looking at the dynamics of who supports what. And yeah, I guess it's also confusing in that support for Israel doesn't necessarily make you part of the political right. It just means you're not part of the political left, I guess.
All right, but the U.S. Democratic Party is super in support of Israel.
Right, and this is why, semantics get all so messy because...
More so than Republicans, I would even say. Republicans seem to be, especially modern Republicans, seem to be a little bit more isolationist. Right. And more, you'll see posts about oh, we're being dragged into this again, that sort of vibe.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's beginning to change. I think Ukraine was a very weird 180 because being more jingoistic in that context was seen as the Democrat position because Democrats had spent years equating Putin with Trump. So, rather than the traditional center left position of questioning war, it became the good liberal thing to want to fight against Putin's cruelty. And I think some of that is carried over to this conflict where some Republicans have continued to hold the isolationist line, where all the mainstream Democrats are lining up behind Israel. But I also have the sense that support for Israel is so ingrained in the Republican DNA. It's not like Ukraine. I think for the most part, the Republican position is still strongly pro-Israel. But you're right, it is changing a little bit.
Well, I think the biggest divide between the left and the right now in the U.S., this doesn't apply to Canada as much, is that the right is more isolationist and the left is more interventionist, no?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting very messy with terms because I guess you are calling the electoral left the left. I view the left as largely outside of the Democratic Party and outside of politics. But
Sure.
I guess I do agree with that weird way in which, yes, in the mainstream, there's more anti-interventionism on the right, even though if you look at like political philosophy and activist culture, anti-interventionism is still the purview of the left. It's just like
we often disagree about what makes up the left and the right. I would say that the modern left is fairly socially conservative compared to their right-wing counterparts, which is odd to say, is comparatively hawkish militarily compared to the right, and is also tends to be a little, I mean, on Israel, but also tends to be a little more, earlier you implied that they were like at odds with, they were anti-corporate, which is, I think I would also question.
Right. So I guess maybe we should even stop using the words left and right in this conversation because I'm trying to find the right word for this. It's sort of like, where do you put the camera, right? If you put the camera on a certain part of the political conversation, you'll see left on one side and right on other. If you sort of swivel the camera to a different view of the population, you get a different sense of the picture. But I think where we broadly agree is that there has been this cultural shift. There's definitely this new kind of liberalism that I'm calling wokeism. You're right. I guess they're more socially conservative in the sense that they've become more cynical about free speech. They, have this sort of more rigid view of the world. And yeah, I mean, I sort of see what you're mean about corporations. Right-wingers have this quasi-critique of corporations like Disney for being too liberal, whereas I guess corporations being liberal endears them to liberal. Yeah, but it's just, what I view as the left, the Noam Chomsky reading part of the world, they still have all the same politics.
But this is an important point because I think what we're seeing in Ryan Long's, I think the reason this Ryan Long video can exist is because right now the left is kind of confused because there's been this huge shift in what they represent, both in terms of isolationism and their stance on like identitarian politics, where now suddenly they care a huge amount about identity politics, and also they have and they are also made more militarily hawkish just because, as you said, like the left has now had to become, they've been kind of forced into this position because Trump was kind of a anti-globalist isolationist. Now the left has, the if we separate between like the as you said, the governmental left, like the representatives of, in U.S. government, and like, as you said, like the philosophical left, the governmental left is kind of forced now to be interventionist because, in response to Trump's isolationist move. And so now the left has to take a strong stance on Ukraine. That is to say, Biden and Democrats have to take a stronger stance on Ukraine. They have to take a stronger stance on places like Israel. And so, unfortunately, even when that is at odds with kind of the modern ground level leftists, I think we don't have a good term for defining the difference here, but the philosophical leftists may not necessarily be on side with that commitment. There's a strange thing where suddenly as I said, like government has become more hawkish, and they haven't really changed their pro-Israel opinion. But at the same time, the left is increasingly skeptical of Israel. The rank and file left. I don't know. I think that's what causes the conflict. Is that what you're kind of? I don't think this Ryan Long video would have existed necessarily as closely 10 years ago.
No.
And I think it's partially because of what I'm saying, because of the new commitments of Democrats geopolitically, and new preferences when it comes to identity politics. Do you see that as the primary conflict?
So I mean, I think there are a number of differences. So I think one of the things 10 years ago is there was a lot less pressure to have the right position on the vast majority of issues. I think what's basically happened since Donald Trump is there's this expectation that celebrities or whoever else is in the public eye are good people, and there's this very strict criteria for who a good person is. And so your options are almost always cave to the demands of that part of the culture, or, you know, go to the other side, go be part of the Joe Rogan, Daily Wire cultural sphere. Not saying they're the same things.
Those are so... Joe Rogan's way more left than I am. He's wildly left. He endorsed Bernie Sanders.
Yes, well...
And it has... I can't find a single right-wing position he has. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would be a Joe Rogan apologist too in other contexts, but I think you would agree that culturally, despite him having all these liberal positions, he's seen as taboo to a lot of people.
Because he's strong and white and bald.
Yeah, and because of the people he hangs out with, and because he's interested, I guess, in conspiracy theories of all kinds, including the more right-coded ones.
Well, actually, I think weirdly this is actually useful for our overall conversation, which is that Joe Rogan, I think, is actually a vestige of a liberalism that existed a while ago, like 10 years ago, because he's left politically on almost any issue you could name. But I think the biggest difference that makes people believe or slot him in as being right-wing is that he's extremely loose with his language and the way he talks in general. He's not very like, he talks pretty loosely. And I think that's not, that's a thing that doesn't fit in with the modern, what I defined as earlier as being like a more conservative bent in modern.
Yeah. So let me try and tie all the big picture elements together. I'm going to call this a Marxist analysis. I don't know if this would hold up to rigor, but basically the superstructure of society creates the conditions that creates ideology. That's the kind of thinking I have. And so we live in this world defined by social media, which means views are broadcast, which means views are more policed. That explains the sort of part of the change we were just talking about. But I think another thing that's going on, so for years, celebrities have been associated with left-leaning politics. And one might think that doesn't make sense. I mean, I imagine in Victorian Britain, there was probably a very sharp divide where all the rich people were very conservative and the workers in the factories, insofar as they had a chance to have politics, were the left. And then at some point in history, we got this class of rich people that wanted to have left politics. But a Marxist would say, well, that's at a tension because their class interest doesn't really tell them to have those politics. So what do? As Jared Bauer said in his video, they pursue pleasure. They pursue the catharsis of taking on left positions. And I guess they seek more and more pleasure. They seek more and more left militant positions that are still compatible with their membership in the mainstream Democratic Party and keeping all their wealth. And they've been pushing further and further. They pushed as far as, flirting with defund the police, I guess with the understanding that it was never really going to happen. People were just going to yell about it for a week and then pretend they never believed in it. And then it just feels like this issue is kind of where the straw broke the camel's back. Hollywood celebrities are willing to pretend to support, radical civil rights protesters in America, but I guess supporting Palestine is a step too far for them.
But wait, okay, so this video I see as, it could be named "The Left is Confused About Its Stance on Israel."
Yes.
You agree that that's kind of what the thrust of this is?
I'll let you run with this, yeah.
Well, then I guess I don't think I've got a clear answer of your take on this. Why do you think the left is split on Israel?
So I guess the part of my model that I realized I forgot to finish there is, this combination of a culture where we have all these public figures wanting to have left positions, we have social media encouraging the broadcasting of the positions. I think celebrity pop culture politics have just become a bigger part of politics. So a lot of, young progressive people might actually look to, what is Sarah Silverman or Amy Schumer or some other similarly situated figure saying on the subject. And if they're saying hashtag stand up to anti-Semitism and that somehow means hashtag stand with Israel, it's going to be a tough decision for them. Whereas, an older left-wing person probably isn't getting their political positions that way.
That's just answering why are people like, but the question would be, why are only some celebrities interested in supportive of Israel? Like why? Because ostensibly left-wing celebrities seem to go either way on this one.
I mean, what I've noticed amongst celebrities is you either see the sort of fairly hardline pro-Israel positions, or you see sort of carefully worded pro-ceasefire positions. The celebrities like Roger Waters, who like really commit to the Palestinian cause, they kind of become pariahs. They're kind of the weirdos. I feel like they're not part of the analysis.
Yeah, I would say that. Okay, wait. So let me try to summarize the point you're making. I think is that the celebrity culture has gone distinctly pro-Israel. I'm not sure that I agree with that. At least it's been more tepid, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges with talking social media, and I mean, even our sense of something like Ryan Long or Joe Rogan's views, is there's just so much out there. It's quite possible we've just seen slightly different bits of the picture, and even that's clouding our sense of the absolute truth. There's just so much content in the internet.
Then it seems like that you actually don't see the left as being split on the Israel topic. Or you're saying the celebrity left isn't, but the average Joe is, I guess is your point.
The average Joe is, yes.
Why? Why now and not before? Like, is there something that causes this particular moment to be a time when the left is split on this issue? Because it doesn't seem like they have been in the past.
Yeah, well,
I don't know that,
yeah. My sense, and I mean, my memory doesn't go very far into the past, is if anything, it used to be, more normal for a broader swath of the North American political spectrum to be pro-Israel because, there wasn't nearly as much social media. There wasn't as much access to far-left critiques of Israel. Then those critiques became available, and then this sort of celebrity way of thinking sort of hit a stop and went, wait a minute, we're not comfortable with the,
critiques of Israel, like critiques about colonialism and occupation.
Exactly,
Yeah, those became more mainstream, you're saying, in the last 10 years?
Yeah.
And now people are wedged between their kind of like the colonialist critique, which is obviously popular domestically, especially if you're Canadian, and the celebrity reflexive pro-Israel.
Exactly.
Interesting. The U.S. doesn't seem to care as much about colonialism as Canada does.
Right. I mean, I have the sense that because of the larger history of slavery there's less discourse about the oppression of Native Americans, whereas just Canada, there's more language about the oppression of Indigenous Canadian residents, and thus more language about colonialism. I think that's the only difference.
I think that's right. And of course, I think that the stats tend to bear that out in the sense that the U.S. seems to be more prevalently, like in poll numbers, supportive of Israel, whereas Canada is a bit more split. Which recently, I only saw a poll like a couple days ago, but
yeah, and I think one of the frustrations though is that even if even though there's more openness to criticizing Israel in Canada, the memo hasn't seemed to gotten across to our mainstream political parties. Both the Conservatives and Liberals are hardline in the Israel camp. The NDP sort of dip their toes in the water of being pro-Palestine, but kind of freak out, anytime someone gets a bit too militant on that.
I think we do see kind of the same picture here.
Yeah.
I think hopefully I characterized you decently well by talking about kind of the anti-colonialism on one hand and the kind of continuation of an ongoing support for Israel among celebrities.
Yes.
I think my take is slightly different, which is that it's the growth of identity politics and the attempt to overlay that on a conflict that doesn't really easily take up the identity politics. I guess if I had to summarize what I see as a conflict very simply, it's like it's very hard when two groups are in conflict. Like, for example, there was a time when, even when Dave Chappelle got in trouble for anti-LGBTQ things, there was a bit of a schism among people where some people didn't want to criticize a black comedian who was talking about the black experience. And I think similarly, wokeism sometimes breaks down when you have two quote unquote marginalized groups in conflict, because it's often, modern leftism is often doesn't really deal with things. It doesn't deal well with conflict between groups. Instead, they usually talk about like, this group is oppressed in isolation. This group is oppressed in isolation, because it's kind of a vertically minded set of politics. It kind of goes, look, they're oppressed by white supremacy or by some other kind of top-down force. They have trouble with conflict between groups. I think that's somewhere in there. Is that something that you also see?
I mean, maybe to sort of tie this all together, if we're looking for a why. Sure. So again, you have celebrities, this sort of left-leaning but very affluent demographic, and often their leftism is motivated by guilt, which means they can't think freely within it. They have to defer to rules. If you're guilty, you have to subject yourself to penance. So they have to be at the mercy of the marginalized groups. Asking for too much nuance is not doing your penance, right? So whereas another person could look at a conflict and say, in this particular case, this is how I see it. The celebrities and those who think them run into a brick wall when they say marginalized group versus marginalized group.
Yeah, okay. We agree on this then. I don't know that there's a good solution for that moving forward. I think this is something we've talked about a little bit before, but I think the left is a little bit painted into a corner because identity politics don't provide a very good way to talk about group versus group when it's zero sum like this, or when it's at least not even zero sum, when there's a conflict. But I think Ryan Long did a great job.
Yeah, I think he did. And I guess my message to those advocating for Palestine right now, I know this is a sort of broad ask, but try and make your case not by reproducing the language of wokeness. Don't tell people their silence is deafening. Don't accuse them of not standing with a marginalized group. Actually make your case in the thorough academic way. Try not to use those woke cliches that reinforce this kind of thinking, because there is a leftism before wokeism, and I believe in you. I believe in your ability to speak that way.
Well, I think that's a very good piece of advice generally. I think a lot of times people make arguments on the basis that the other person is pro-oppression of a marginalized group, when very often, both in this conversation and others, the likelihood that your opponent thinks that they are in support of the oppression of a marginalized group is very low.
Exactly.
Anyway, so you got to use language that subverts that. This has been very productive. Do you have any closing remarks? I think you just made your closing remarks. Maybe I should have some, but...
Yeah, I mean, I guess last time I came up with a quotation. I don't have anything like that today. Do you have any witty way to send us off?
I don't have a good one. I think this is effectively a podcast about a comedy sketch. So I wish I did. Both you and I have done some stand-up in the last year or so. So maybe we're letting the world down, but I thank you all for joining us. I'm Fraser Allen Best.
I'm Zach Morgenstern. See you next time.
Well, I doubt your party's gonna save the